If you are new to construction, please go to the notes and click on the link to our beginning skill saw use video. There are things you need to know about skill saws and practice with the skill saw before you even watch some of the professional tricks that we've included in this video. They are counterintuitive, they're dangerous, but they're highly productive. You need to start at the beginning. That's pretty good. Visually, it's good. It feels good. It is good. By the way, that's one of the rules of construction. If it looks good, it is good. Now, there are exceptions to that, but lots of times it's true. So all these boards need to be cut at 7 foot long. Crow's foot, speed square, one measurement, one mark, 4 boards. That's a time saver. The accuracy is good. Or at least it's good if the table on your saw is still square. That's why if you ever drop your saw, I'm a 1/16 of an inch short. Probably good enough for framing. If I was doing this on a production basis, I would be holding to the left and I would be checking about every 4th cut to keep the accuracy good. There's another way to do this. Square across. I missed it. Make sure your table is square. Let's see how we did. Check it out. It's nice, and it didn't take long to do it. Now let's say you've got to cut some rafters. Imagine these are bigger or longer. It doesn't really matter, it's all the same process. Let's say it's a 6/12 pitch. You put the 6 on the short leg, the 12 on the long leg. You see that? Same side of the square, same side of the board. That means that for every 12 inches of run, there's 6 inches of rise, and you mark the pitch. Now on the other end, we'll put the plumb cut on. We're not going to specify the length for this video. 6/12. There's a plumb cut. And let's say we want about a 12-inch overhang, 13.5 including the thickness of the fascia. There's the back of the bird's mouth. We'll put the same 6/12 pitch on there, only we'll use the bottom of the board instead of the top. Mark the back of the bird's mouth. Then we will give full 3.5-inch bearing as if we're using a 2x4 plate on the wall. There's the bird's mouth. Here's how I would cut these. Now, overcutting that bird's mouth is not a structural issue. If the owner doesn't like it, you stop short, clean it up with a chisel or a sawzall. That's one, and your pattern has been transferred to the next one. Now let's say that this was actually a hip rafter or a valley rafter, and I had to put a side cut on this where it intersected either a ridge or a valley. I, of course, set my table to 45 degrees or whatever the side cut was, set my depth to whatever I liked, and cut it. And many times that's what you ought to do. But sometimes, particularly if you're skilled at this, you can do it this way instead. Leave it square, turn the board on its edge, and cut a lovely bevel without taking the time to change the setting on your saw. Let's see how we did. "45 degrees. Is it perfect? No. Is it close enough for framing a roof system? Absolutely. Is it efficient? Absolutely. You can do the same thing on a rip. Presto. Pretty good. Now a 7 1/4 inch skill saw will only cut 2 1/4 inches deep. That's not enough to get through a 6x6. How is this to be solved? Well, a lot of times you can get out your Sawzall and plug it in and finish the cut, but there's another way. So obviously I didn't reach all the way through. So I either go get the Sawzall or I take my beam over and drop it. Breaking the residue.
Yep, not bad.
And then cleaning it up with the skill saw with a technique that's known as the Polish plane. Somewhat dangerous. We don't build cabinets like this, but we make posts. So let's imagine that I want to make a mortise or a notch in this 4x4, the depth of this 2x6 and the width of this 2x6. I set my depth by using the piece as a gauge. I push the saw down until it projects down to the level of the surface that the block is on and lock it. That tells me that my blade is projecting exactly the thickness of that piece. Next, I would take the piece and scribe it. About 9 times out of 10, scribing is better than measuring and squaring. Then I would cut a series of notches. I'm going to do half of it right now. I'll show you why. I knock the notches out. You can see that pin knot sticking up. That complicates it.
Okay, go ahead.
Now obviously this is rough work, but framing houses is rough work. It has to be done square, plumb, and true, with appropriate fit up and fastening to make it structurally sound. Most of the time, good, fast, professional work is beautiful and people can afford it. So let's talk a little more about plunge cutting. It's dangerous because you are bringing the spinning blade into contact with a stationary object without any real, without it being securely braced, except by your wrist in the front of the saw. But if you have to plunge, typically you elevate the guard, although you don't have to, get a good hold. Now that doesn't look like much, but it can hurt you. Now if you can do it without lifting the guard with your other hand, by moving the saw forward to push the guard back. Let me demonstrate a little more of the Polish plane method that we showed earlier. Now that's ugly, but there are a lot of applications.
Yep.
Now if you don't have a sky hook and you're up in the air and you're in a bind, you got to let yourself down, you got to pick something up, you got the saw in your hand, you don't know what to do, you've got a couple other alternatives. One, you can just plunge the saw and it'll hang there. That did not degrade that board because I merely subtracted 1/8 of an inch of thickness parallel to the grain. Didn't hurt a thing. Any more than that little bit of wane reduces the strength of that board. A plunge cut doesn't hurt it, and you can leave your saw up in the air, perfectly safe. Now note, there are some owners that will not appreciate this when you try to explain it to them, but it doesn't hurt a thing. There's another way to hang this from a rafter if you can't plunge cut and you don't have a sky hook, and it's like that.
Cool.
You can use the same technique for lowering the saw from a great distance to someone on the ground or just to the ground. You probably already know that it's not good for the saw to carry it around like this. You're putting a strain on the electrical connections inside. But it doesn't hurt the saw at all to carry it around like that. You can raise and lower that. You can hook it clear around the table if you want. You can swing it. You can do whatever you want. Now, the two things that I do immediately. First, I put a 40-foot cord on this saw. 60 was better when I was stacking a lot of roofs. 40 is about enough. And I use a chain stitch to store it. Now, you may be familiar with that. The way I look at it, if you intentionally tangle your saw cord when you put it away, it's not going to accidentally get tangled in the box. But it comes apart like this. And it's ready to roll. On top of that, it doesn't get the repetitive twisting that happens when you wind a cord around your arm or make a coil carelessly. This takes some set, but it's not really twisted. So here is how I put the chain stitch on the cord on this Skil Saw. The chain stitch is really just single stitch crochet. Don't let that bother your manhood on the job site. The other guys don't need to know it. I take the bitter end, I stick it through the handle, I take the first bite of both lines that I come to, stick it through the top handle, and then take bites with my right hand, stick it through the loop that's formed and held open with my left hand, single stitch crochet, down to the end, stick it through, voila, pre-tangled. Out of the truck. Now the other thing that I do immediately is put a sky hook on it. I particularly like this model. Can't tell you who makes it, but it folds away out of the way, either up or down, and it works beautifully for hanging your saw on a rafter or a joist. Okay, works great. And then pick it up, you're up in the air, you're stacking or you're rolling joist, out of the way, away you go. Sky hooks are nice. They'll save your saw. So when we think of putting a square cut, a 90-degree cut on the end of a board, typically we think, well, we put a mark on here at a specified length, and then we get out some sort of a square, a framing square or a tri-square or a speed square. I happen to have a speed square in my hand. And you carefully make the mark, and then you put the square away and you put the pencil back in your pocket. And you pick up your saw and you start on the edge of the board. And that's great, but there's another way, especially on 2x4s, when the tolerance is, plus or minus 1/16 of an inch. You can put your mark on. Put the tape and the pencil away. Use the squareness of the saw. That's not too good, but it's within 1/16 of an inch. Let's do that again. There's another application. You can start on the edge and roll it and get a 90. See that? So the key to being a good hand is to understand allowable tolerances. Sometimes if you're working to plus or minus 1/64 of an inch, you're working way too sloppy. Sometimes if you're working to plus or minus 2 feet, you're cutting it way too fine. So the key to being a productive carpenter is knowing the allowable tolerances for the task and for the job. So a common frustration is running into a piece of steel and dulling your blade. That is not as common as it used to be when blades were just tool steel. Carbide doesn't mind eating a few nails. I'm going to demonstrate that. I have here two 16-penny vinyl coated sinkers, standard construction issue, good nails. We'll talk about those someday. I'm going to put a couple of them in the end of this board. Run one end at an angle. The key is to feed the saw slowly if you know you're going to cut a nail. Didn't hurt that saw at all. Tough on the nails though. You've noticed that I don't use a whole bunch of safety gear. I don't use safety glasses because I wear glasses. I don't use ear protection because then I can't hear what's going on in the environment around me. That all changes when I use a Skil saw to cut roofing metal. Now you don't think of a Skil saw as something that typically is used to cut metal, but it will cut light gauge roofing metal, 21, 23 gauge roofing metal beautifully, quickly, very noisy. I'm going to demonstrate that with this old sheet of roofing material. You have to use ear protection with this. And you have to use eye protection because the chips that fly out of this process are vicious and they're sharp and they're hot. So I'll use this old full face shield. I'm going to demonstrate cross-cutting and then ripping a standard 2-foot wide delta pattern piece of roofing material. So this demonstrates the beauty of a carbide blade. You can cut through metal if you feed evenly, slowly. It doesn't degrade the blade at all. It will over time, but you can see that all the teeth are intact. Still rips Douglas fir beautifully. Now, some people will take a plywood blade and turn it around backwards. That's even noisier. It doesn't work as well. As far as cutting metal, if when you're framing or remodeling, you cut a nail or you see you have to cut a nail, get a good hold of your saw, feed slowly, push steadily through the nail. It won't hurt your blade much, but you ought to have eye protection on, that's for sure. Anytime you're in close proximity to a Skil saw, there's an element of risk that has to be accounted for. These things are dangerous. Never assume that because everyone around you appears to be able to do this safely, that it is safe. Never assume that just because you can pick it up and pull the trigger, you know how to use it. You've got to be on guard every second or it'll bite you.